You can thank me later in the comments for that mental image. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to episode 36 of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host, KiramidHead, and tonight I'm going to be looking at two different unproduced drafts and an outline for the Tomb Raider movie from the 1990s, from before the 2001 movie was released. Now, before I get into the details of these scripts, I'm going to go into my relative unfamiliarity with the series. And it was one of those things where, because I was fairly young when these games first started coming out. I was like 4 when the first one released. But I'd kind of heard of them and knew about them because my older brothers played games. But I never really got into gaming until much later, until Tomb Raider's popularity had kind of come and gone. And I didn't start playing those games until the most recent reboot, when the popularity kind of came back again for a while. But my understanding of the series, like, I know the first one has to do with Atlantis and something called the Scion, and there's like some T-Rexes in it or something. And I know the second one has something to do with this Chinese dagger. And the thing I know about the third one is that in that game, you go around killing innocent security guards and police officers with no consequences and no repercussions, and it's kind of fucked up. And I know Last Revelation is well liked. Chronicles is considered okay. And Angel of Darkness, which is what killed the core design era of Tomb Raider, is said to have it's said to have a really good story. It's just because it was rushed, the gameplay is like really buggy and unplayable, so it makes it not that great of a game. And of course, that got core design booted off the series. And then Crystal Dynamics came on and did their trilogy through the PS2 and into the PS3 era, which I've seen that trilogy of games in like an HD collection. I have not gotten around to buying it, but I have been thinking about it. I'm more familiar with Tomb Raider 2013 and its sequel. Now, granted, I haven't played the 2013 game since 2013, but I did enjoy it at the time. I thought the whole survival aspect of the game was pretty cool, and I liked how it did genuinely feel like the odds were stacked against you being cast adrift on this island. And the whole way it went from like survival story and slowly introduced sort of the supernatural elements as it went along, I thought was pretty cool. And this whole idea of the supernatural storm queen Himiko and like her crazy samurai zombie guards and stuff like that, I thought that was cool. And I thought the human villain, the Father Matthias, was pretty interesting in a way, because if I remember it correctly, his whole plan in that game was just build this cult, gain control of Himiko so that he can control this crazy supernatural storm and get off the island. I thought that made him a rather kind of interesting character, the way he manipulated everything to that end. And the sequel, Rise of the Tomb Raider, I just played that like last month, because it was Xbox exclusive for a year, and then it just completely slipped my mind to think if it had even come out yet, so I just got it for Christmas this past year and played it, and I thought it was pretty decent. I liked the story with the whole divine source thing and the prophet and Trinity trying to get this power for themselves, and Laura kind of being caught up in the middle of this. And I liked how it was laid out, where you would have these really big areas you would wander around in. There would be people offering you little side quests you could go and do. And I thought that was a fun little wrinkle to add to the formula that the first one set up. But it did kind of feel like it was kind of resting on its laurels and kind of repeating some of the same things that were done in the 2013 game. Like, you still lose all your stuff, and you got to build it back up again from scratch. There's still weird zombie guys who show up in the last third of the game. And there's like a cult as the bad guys, and it was a little too familiar, but it was still a good game, and I'm looking forward to whatever the third one is going to be like. But yeah, I do like those games. Now, as for the movies, I was aware of the marketing for them when they were coming out, but I didn't see them until years later. The first one is more watchable than it has any right to be. It's not a particularly good movie, but it's got enough decent action to it and enough, sort of things going on that it is reasonably watchable. The actual tomb raiding scenes are pretty good, like the stuff in Cambodia and in Siberia at the end. I think the first, half of the movie when they're in England, I think that goes on too long, and there's too many just random clues strung together. And it could be a stronger story. And a lot of that is because the whole thing was cobbled together at the last minute by Simon West deciding he didn't like the script he had, so he was going to write his own. And then Angelina Jolie said, hey, I want to do something with my father, John Voight. So they wrote in the whole subplot with Lord Richard Croft and how she's like all upset over him disappearing and being presumed dead. And like all of John Voight's scenes were clearly filmed in one day because they're like 90% of them are him sitting in a tent. And there's like one little quick shot of him in the manor and one little quick shot of him standing in front of a green screen on a cliff, and that's it. And it just feels tacked on, and you could almost cut it out of the movie. Angelina Jolie gives a pretty good performance. Like, she's a charismatic actress and she sells the action scenes. Ian Glenn, like, Powell's not a great villain, but Glenn does a good job of playing him. He has this smarmy kind of feel to him that's a lot of fun and makes him just this despicable character. Daniel Craig, this is a pre-Fame, pre-James Bond Daniel Craig, and he's stuck playing an American character, and his American accent is what the fuck levels of bad. Like, if there was ever a scene of him talking and he was out of frame, I would have to stop and go, oh yeah, that's Daniel Craig. And his character is so irrelevant to the proceedings of the movie, you could almost cut him out. You could almost cut Daniel Craig out of this movie. In fact, I don't even know why Lara bothers with the whole time travel thing to save his life at the end, because he has no effect on anything in the movie. And that's another thing with the movie, is that I think the MacGuffin being this magical triangle that does vague things, including time travel and maybe other stuff, I think is kind of lame. And they put the Illuminati in the movie for some reason. I think that's kind of weird. It's a decent one-time watch, even if watching it you can tell it was cobbled. It's a bunch of cobbled together scenes to try and make some sense of a plot that was apparently that they had to bring in another editor at the last minute to save it. And yeah, you can kind of tell that's the case. Now, Cradle of Life, I thought, was a much better movie, and it's a film that generally gets a weaker response from people, and I thought it was a bit better. You had a stronger written plot. Things kind of flowed a little bit better. There was a stronger villain with actual stakes in the form of Rice, who wants to unlock Pandora's box and unleash this kind of possibly supernatural super plague into the world. And because that's what his end game is, it just feels like the stakes are higher. And because you don't have Daniel Craig around doing his terrible American accent, you instead have Gerard Butler, another pre-Fame actor, hanging around. I thought their whole relationship was pretty good. And that bit at the end where she has to kill him to keep him from taking Pandora's box out of its hiding place, I thought that was pretty strong. And what I liked about the movie is that it feels like a Pierce Brosnan Bond film, not one of the dumb ones. Like, it feels kind of in step with Tomorrow Never Dies. And so I quite enjoyed the movie. Now, the reboot that's coming out, I was kind of looking forward to it. And I like the idea that they're kind of following from what the 2013 game and its sequel were doing. But I'm not sure I'm sold on some of the choices that's made, like combining the two stories, like doing the island of Yamatai and Himiko, and also throwing Trinity and Lara's father into the mix. And I read about 30 pages of the screenplay because I didn't want to spoil anything. And I read it, and it was not the most well-written thing from a technical standpoint. Like, it just read really blandly. And I don't know if I'd really care to see that movie, but I'll probably go check it out just out of curiosity. I think Alicia Vikander is a pretty decent choice for the modern day version of Lara. I don't know. That movie has it's got to do a lot to really kind of win me over from some of the weird choices it's making. Now, to move on to the script, the way they started at making a movie is that Core Design and Eidos, they started getting offers. They started getting offers from film studios only like 6 months after the first game came out because it was such a huge smash. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the very first attempt at writing a Tomb Raider script from July of 1998, and it's written by Brent V. Friedman. He wrote a film I really like called The Resurrected, which is one of the best H.P. Lovecraft adaptations, in my opinion. I think that's a really good adaptation of the case of Charles Dexter Ward. And he also wrote Mortal Kombat Annihilation, but there were a lot of things going against that movie, namely it being rushed and all these actors not coming back, and a lot of that's down to New Line fucking around, so I can't really blame him too badly for that. And this script on the whole, the basic plot of this one is that you get, after getting a brief origin story showing Lara as a teenager and her parents dying, it cuts to like 13 years later, and she gets word from a colleague that he's found a map that leads to the location of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold in South America. And so she's in the race against time with this group of unscrupulous Australians led by a guy called Malvern, who seeks El Dorado for his own nefarious purposes, which we'll find out as we talk about the script. And she's assisted in her journey by this kind of rugged Han Solo type American guy named Dodge, who's a guide who lives in Peru. And so to get into the details of the script is that it starts with the date 1986, and you have Lara Croft, who's 16 years old, and she's at boarding school, and she's telling her fellow students about how her parents, Lord Desmond and Lady Vivian, are these tomb raiding adventurers, and how they grabbed this item from the tomb of Genghis Khan and fought back against the Mongolian army. But it turns out that she's just kind of made these stories up as like kind of a way to romanticize the fact that her parents are always away on business. And they send her these trinkets back as souvenirs, and she talks about them like they're these important relics. And I know that this is not what her parents are in the games. In fact, I actually did a little research on this just to see, what the older games said about her parents. And apparently they didn't say a whole lot other than the fact that they were Lord Henshingly Croft and Lady No First Name Croft, and that they did not approve of her choice of adventuring lifestyle, so they disowned her, and that's about it. So this is kind of making stuff up, and I think this technically would be the first incarnation of Tomb Raider where Lara Croft's parents were actually a part of it. But okay, so they come to visit her at school, and they say, we're absent all the time, so we're going to make it up to you, and we'll take you on a trip anywhere you want to go. So she says, let's go to Tibet, because she wants to ski down this mountain that no one has ever skied down before. And while they're on the flight there, she's talking with her mother, and they're talking about the one item they sent back to her, and about how it's this kind of Tibetan exorcism drum that they bang it over the head of a dead body at a funeral to try and exorcise. It's like bad vibes or something like that. I forget the details. And it shows that her mother has a respect for cultures and all that. But then, they're on their plane heading to Tibet, and then something bad, like they lose power and the plane crashes, the pilots are killed, and her mother is hit in the head with a piece of fuselage, and she dies after saying, Lara, always follow your dreams. And so Lara, she gets some supplies, and her father, who's still somewhat alive, and she manages to get him out of the plane just before it falls into a chasm and explodes. And so she puts together a makeshift shed, and she's dragging him around for a while. And eventually she catches sight of a monastery in the distance. But before they can go forward, they start getting surrounded by snow leopards, and they're backed up against a cliff, and of course she can't take him with them any longer. So the father says, please leave me behind, but she does everything she can to try and save his life. She sets up a ring of black powder and sets it on fire to keep the snow leopards at bay for at least a little while. And then she jumps down the cliff, hurts her ankle, but she manages to drag herself up to this monastery, and there's this older monk named Karak who sees her, and then he leads a rescue party to get her father, but he's already died in the meantime. And while the funeral is going on, Karak decides that, his new destiny is to mentor Lara and to try and help her overcome her grief and reach her potential. Okay, to talk about this origin story for a bit, this is one of the weaker parts of the script. Like, what I would change is, instead of the whole thing about her telling stories about her parents, but they're really just these kind of boring people, maybe make them into just regular archaeologists, like not the kind of adventurer archaeologists that Lara kind of becomes later on in life, but make them into just regular archaeologists, which is what gives her respect for the cultures and stuff. And the other thing I would change is, because as this draft is written, we get more of an idea of her relationship with her mother than with her father. They seem closer. So I would change it to make it that it's her father who gets killed in the crash, and it's her mother that she's trying to drag to safety. I think just in the terms of this script, that's the change I would make. And so it cuts to 13 years later, well, she goes from 16 to 29, but it says it's 1998, and And Lara is now this fully formed adventurer. She's been on multiple jobs, as she called them, and she's turned Croft Estate into this elaborate training ground, and you see her like diving into a pool to like gather weights up from the bottom, and she's doing like gymnastics and stuff, and Karak is now her instructor and trainer, and he's talking about like, you need to take a vacation, and he suggests Club Med, but she's not really, up for that, because she's just getting rest. She likes going on these adventures and stuff. And then as this is going on, it cuts to somewhere in the Caribbean. There's a this cartographer named Darby Erickson, and he has a diver named Arturo who are on a salvage boat, and they're checking out this shipwreck, and they exhume this special tube with a map in it, which they think shows the location of El Dorado, and because it's a dangerous sort of expedition to undertake, he decides he's going to contact Laura. And we cut back to England, and her Aunt Evelyn visits, and she's moaning about how the place has changed, and that she needs Laura to sign all the paperwork, and that, oh, your mother was this proper lady, always throwing parties, and blah, 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 blah. And Laura's like, okay, I'll catch up on the paperwork by next week, and I'll come to your party. And I'm like, I don't need the aunt showing up talking about paperwork and being a proper lady and all that. I don't need that. The character's kind of annoying. And okay, so that night, Arturo, he arrives at the Croft estate in a cab, and he's wounded. He bleeds to death on the driveway. But before he dies, he hands Laura a high 8 tape, which that doesn't completely date this script. And it's the message from Darby, who's talking to her about his find, and he holds up the map and shows it to her, and he talks about his unscrupulous Australian employers who are out to get him and didn't believe his story about not actually finding anything. And he's offering Laura a 50-50 split of the treasure. He says, meet me in Curacao at the Elmar Hotel. I'm going to be under the name of Flanagan. And then right as he's finishing up, Arturo's in the background, and they hear pounding on the door, and it's the Australians, and Darby, jumps out the window, and then they come bursting through the door with a shotgun, and Arturo gets wounded, and so we get introduced to Larson, who's basically the henchman, and Malvern, who's the guy who's behind everything. But Darby has gotten away, and they decide they're going to leave him. They're going to leave Arturo alive because, they're okay with suffering or something like that. Now, this really confused me because we went from the Caribbean, and apparently they went to England, and I don't really get this, because it's not explained. So did they leave the Caribbean and go to England, and then Arturo got wounded and took the cab out to the Croft estate and then died? Because it's not specified, and that's what would make sense. So yeah, that's a little weird. Okay, and so the next day, here's one of the worst parts of this script for me. She goes to get some gadgets that she ordered because she has these 3 engineering students who work for her in return for her paying off their tuition. And she calls them the Gadget Boys, and they're these 3 guys, I can't be bothered to remember their names. They're these irritating geek stereotypes, and one of them sees her coming, driving up to the building on her motorcycle, and he's watching through the telescope trying to look down her shirt, and they're all busy trying to impress her and blah blah blah. I hate these guys, they're annoying. And they all give her some gadgets, some of which where I'm I don't know if these are really you need engineering students to cook these up for you. It's one of them is just basically a camera probe on the end of a roto-rooter. One of them is a diving tank, and the other one is this kind of gun that shoots out pitons and all these other kinds of ammunition. It really doesn't make a difference. You could write this stuff out kind of easily. And she promises to take them all out for a pint when she gets back from this mission. And okay, so she returns to the estate that night, and she starts getting attacked by mysterious assassins, and she's running around the wall around the estate, and she has to zip line over to the house, and then she's crawling up on the roof, there's an assassin in the house, and she runs to the edge of the roof, but oh no, she can't jump. And then it turns out that the assassins were Karak and the gardening staff, who apparently decided to attack her as part of a training exercise. And I'm why are we doing this lame training exercise fake out shit? It's not good when other action movies do it. It's not that great here. And the one redeeming element of it is the fact that she can't force herself to make the jump because she still has those unresolved issues over the fact that she made the jump and hurt herself, and she didn't get help in time for her father, which is a decent part of her character arc in this. Did it have to be a fucking training exercise, where they do their best to try and kill her? And there's this weird thing, right, where during this thing, a couple of statues in the garden, one statue at least gets its head blown off, but then they're cleaning everything up, and it's oh, it was just a squib. I'm not sure how that... Okay, so she leaves after that scene, and she goes to Curacao, which is an island in the Caribbean just north of Venezuela. I looked this up yesterday, I almost forgot. And she goes to the hotel room, and the bellboy calls up Malvern and says, Mr. Flanagan has a lady friend. She goes up to Darby's room, but turns out he's been shot and killed, and the map's been stolen. And there's some plastic explosives hooked up to the light that she just turned on, and so she jumps out the window just in time and into the water as the place blows up. And then we see Malvern and his group. They head to the village of Francisco de Orellana in Peru, and they buy up as much supplies as they can and burn the rest to keep anyone from following them. And they also tried to hire Dodge, who's this American expatriate who's living in Francisco de Orellana and hires himself off as a guide to people who want to go into the jungle looking for El Dorado. But he takes one look at these guys and goes, yeah, you're kind of dangerous to be around. I'm not sure I want. And of course, not long after this, Lara Croft, she arrives in town on the bus, and she's playing with her laptop, and she managed to enhance the image of the map from Darby's video, which, not sure you can do that with a high 8 tape unless you happen to be Rick Deckard. You know, whatever, I'll give it a pass. It's kind of a clever idea. And so she hires Dodge and his trawler, and so they're talking, and there's some definite chemistry between them. And while they're on the trawler, he talks about how, like, he used to be like this rich college kid who was like a scholar who went looking for El Dorado, and he lost everything in the process, and so he decided he was just going to become a guy to make money off it rather than actually go finding it himself. And I like this part of the script. It had this definite kind of African queen kind of vibe to it, with the proper British lady and the gruff American on the boat going upriver, which is not so subtly signposted by the fact that earlier in the script at the Croft estate, Laura's watching that movie on TV, and I'm like, she must be thinking, damn, this is a weird coincidence. And so they're going up the river, and they get sucked into a whirlpool, and one of the boatmen named Paolo, he goes overboard, and they're all trying their best to save him, and she manages to like grasp his hand to try and pull him back in, and then a caiman, a kind of crocodile or alligator that's in the river, just moves up and just bites him and like tears him away, and she's left holding the severed hand. And that's pretty gruesome, and it's a pretty exciting sequence too. And so Malvern and his men arrive at because the map is showing a lake that's supposed to be at this specific location, but it's not named, and so they're assuming it's this lake called Lake Guaranita, where it's this volcanic basin. And there's someone at one point in searching for a treasure there had cut a notch into the edge, into the side of the basin to try and drain it unsuccessfully. And the idea is that the hidden door that's supposed to lead to El Dorado is under the lake. But, as Lara is explaining to Dodge on the boat, magnetic north has shifted since the 1500s, meaning that the lake they're looking at is too far south, and that the door is actually in the remains of another lake that was drained by volcanic activity in 1824. And I like that. I like that Lara knows her stuff about geography and the way the world works in history and all that. And I like that she is genuinely clever and kind of a step ahead of the bad guys, while not necessarily undermining the intelligence of the bad guys either. I think that's actually a pretty good way to go about it. And so they get to some rapids, and that's as far as the boat can go. And so Dodge stops the trawler, and he says, okay, I'm going to wait here until you get back or the shooting starts. And he tells the remaining boatmen, Carlos and Luis, to go along with her to protect them. And she says, ignore him. If you're going to come with me, do it because you're going to earn some real money. And so they decide to go along with her. And they find Malvern's base camp. It's being guarded by 2 of his 6 men. And she sees them shooting a peccary with an Uzi, and so she just decides to fuck around with them. Knocks them out with darts, douses them with honey to attract fire ants, and then she steals part of their plane's ignition system called it's called a cam interrupter, I think. I don't know if that's actually a part or if it's just made up by the writer, but basically what you find out later is that she's planning ahead in case Dodge leaves. She needs her own way out of the area, so she's making sure they can't take the plane themselves, which is clever. I don't know why she needed to fuck with these guys, but whatever. Makes her kind of look like a bitch. Who cares if they're shooting a fucking wild pig? Okay, but so they're going through the jungle, and Louise is killed by a mine planted by Malvern's men. And then they see the explosion. Lara is smart in a smart move, puts the dead peccary on top of where the mine was and then hides that they think it was the pig that set off the mine. And then they move on, and that kills Luis. Luis is killed by the mine, and so her and Carlos are moving along, and eventually Malvern catches sight of her with binoculars and goes, hey, she's going to find another entrance. And so they find and so Lara and Carlos, they find the entrance in the bright volcanic vent. And then they go down, there's a secret door which closes behind them, and it's compared to an airlock because originally it was underwater and it needed the water getting in. I don't know how that works with ancient technology, but it's an interesting idea. And so they go down a shaft, and they're avoiding a blade trap, and they find themselves in they're in the outer hallway of 3 burial chambers. Straight ahead of them is the burial chamber of Manco, the last king of the Incas. And then to each side is one for his wife and one for his son, who is named Prince Tupac, which just made me laugh my ass off. I'm like, did he die in the early 90s? I don't know. Is he a rapper? And so they go over to the doors to Manco's tomb, and they try to skip over the other two, but if they try and open it without getting the proper keys, the floor opens up and Laura almost gets impaled on spikes. So they go to Prince Tupac's tomb first, and she mentions that in her experience, the booby traps in tombs are based on how the people are buried in them lived or died, and he had his head chopped off and was burned. So she goes in there. The stairs retract, and it starts flooding with oil, which stops after a certain height. And so she goes over to the sarcophagus, which has the key on top of it. She takes the key off, and the sarcophagus lowers into the floor, and there's flints on the back of it which strike and set the oil on fire. And she just manages to get out. And then the queen's tomb, she goes over to the sarcophagus, and spikes come out of the lid, and it tries to flip up and impale her. But then the walls, because there's like a longer kind of hallway to get there, the walls start closing in. And so Laura does this thing where, okay, she takes the key, she takes the sarcophagus lid and uses it to jam it open for just long enough so she can get out. But then right as she's getting out, the sarcophagus lid breaks, and then the thing closes together. It just barely catches the end of her ponytail. And I actually think that's kind of clever, because it is kind of funny how she goes running around in these games with these braids and how they never get caught on anything. In fact, in Rise of the Tomb Raider, she's got a ponytail and she's always stopping to fix it when you get in and out of the water. It's like, come on, Laura, priorities. And I liked this bit of the script. I thought it was nice seeing some legit tomb raiding, and I liked, the tricks and traps and like all that. And it is very much Indiana Jones light, but I found that to be pretty fun. But okay, as they get out of the Queen's tomb, the two Australian men, who they get names really briefly in dialogue, but in terms of like the character names, they're just called Aussie number 3 and Aussie number 4. And the guys she covered in honey are Aussie number 1 and Aussie number 2. But these guys, like, they come in, they snipe Carlos and kill him, and they're shooting at Laura, and so she takes her diving tank and throws it at... She somehow makes a bomb out of it, but she like throws it at them and blows them up, which is pretty cool. And then she threatens Malvern over the walkie-talkie, saying, "Never send men to do a girl's work," which is kind of a lame line, but it could work depending on the delivery. But she enters Manco's tomb using the 2 keys, and there's like a room with a reflecting pool, and then the inner chamber is blocked by bars that she can't slip past. So she takes the camera probe that she has and looks in there, and she takes pictures of the murals on the walls and of the hieroglyphics on the sarcophagus so that she can examine them later. And the mural on the wall has a picture of Manco holding this black vase-like object, which gets explained later. And then suddenly the room starts flooding and spikes emerge from the ceiling, and then thinking on her feet, she says, hey, there must be somewhere that this water is coming in. So she swims down, finds this narrow passage that she swims through, and ends up out in Lake Guaranita, the other lake, so there was a secondary exit there. And she gets out of there, and then Malvern notices that the cam interrupter is missing in the plane, and so they surround the base camp trying to catch her. But she sneaks in by like shooting a line between 2 trees and shimmying along, and so she puts the part back in the plane, but the keys aren't there, so she has to shimmy on down to get the keys from a tent. But that almost goes wrong because she runs out of power, and so something weird happens with the gadget, like it loses its thrust or something. I'm not really sure what's going on, but she makes enough noise that it attracts the bad guys, and they come shooting at her. And then so she gets into the plane and flies away. Turns out Malvern has a surface-to-air missile, and he just shoots his own plane down out of the air, but Laura manages to eject in time, and so she has to walk her way down to the village. And Malvern, he calls up his ship, which is off the shore, which is from a whaling company called Sea-Pro, which he owns, which we'll talk about in a minute. He says, hey, send me a helicopter to get me out of these mountains. They end up down in the village again. They're in the village again, and they're tearing through the village looking for her and interrogating the natives. And then Laura shows up all covered in dirt and leaves and stuff for having gone through the jungle, and she's talking to Dodge, and she says that El Dorado in Spanish actually means the golden man or the gilded one, and she says that must be Manco. And so and this is actually a pretty clever twist, because origin of the El Dorado myth was indeed about a golden man. In fact, it related to this lake called Lake Guadavita, which there was this tribe. They would like cover their chief in gold dust and take him out on a raft with like a bunch of gold trinkets. And they would throw the gold into the lake, and then he would swim in the lake and wash the gold dust off. And that's where the legend of El Dorado comes from. In fact, Lake Guadavita is in a volcanic crater, like the lake in this script. And in fact, there were explorers who tried to drain the lake to get to the gold. So they cut a hole in the ridge, like they mentioned earlier. So yeah, this Friedman did do his research to an extent. Now, and of course, the Golden Man idea would also be used in the first Uncharted game in a very different way. And this adds a further twist to it when we get. And she says that the murals, and she like examines the murals and the hieroglyphs, and she says that Manco possessed an item called the Black Veil, which could produce or find gold. She's not sure which. And Dodge is talking. He says, Laura, I made some calls, and Malvern, he owns this whaling company, and it's gone bankrupt, and so he's desperate and will do anything. But he agrees to the 50-50 split that Darby originally offered to Laura, and so they set off together. And they have a couple of close encounters with Malvern, and they make it a Dodge's seaplane and take off. But something funny is going on because they think they're being fired on, but Malvern's men are actually firing at the jungle. So you're like, wait a minute. And Malvern's like, playing out just as I intended. And so they're in the seaplane, and Laura says that they have to go to this place called the Cradle of Gold. It's referred to in this Incan name, which I can't remember. It's very long and hard to pronounce. It said it's in the mountains north of Machu Picchu. And so they fly up there, and Malvern's following close behind them. And so they arrive. There's this thing where they're climbing the mountain, and Dodge almost falls to his death, but Laura saves his life. And their attraction is kind of growing during this scene. And so they're climbing up to the mountain. There's these ruins on top of the mountain, and there's these stairs that seem to go to nowhere. And according to the hieroglyphs and the murals, they need to use this staircase to somehow find it. And so they determine that they need to get the sun to shine to find, the entrance to this shrine where the Black Veil is kept. And Laura determines that, it's got to be the sun at this particular solstice, but that's months away. And in order to get the right angle, she takes the lenses from their sunglasses and uses it to reflect the light in the right way. And it points to this crack in the stone, and she pushes that stone, and the staircase opens up and goes down. And so they go down there. There's a bunch of traps down there, including part, which, okay, I don't like this part. The fucking rolling boulder from Raiders of the Lost Ark makes an appearance. It's like, okay, I know Lara Croft is kind of Indiana Jones light and with tits. You don't need to be quite so blatant about it. But there's a bunch of different blade traps. Like there's this one place where the traps, they don't just get triggered once. They get triggered whenever you step on the pressure plate. So they have to run through there fast. And that was pretty cool. And then you get to a room where there's they have to cross this pool that's filled with hostile barracudas. And so they have to knock these pillars down in order to make a bridge. That was pretty fun. And so then they get into the shrine, which is made out of gold. And they find the Black Veil, and they follow, the legend of the Black Veil. They put their hands on either side of it. Dodge puts a ring in it, and it gets converted into liquid gold. And I like this idea of this magical artifact that can transmute substances. I think that's a really clever take on the El Dorado thing and the Golden Man. It's just a really neat idea and kind of creative. And then Malvern, Larson, and their 4 remaining men, they enter the room, and it turns out that Dodge sold Laura out and led them there because they were going to kill her regardless. And so he said, hey, he wanted them to spare her life. So he said, hey, I'll help her and we'll lead you to where El Dorado is. And it's also mentioned that Malvern, he researched into Laura, and he starts egging her on, talking about her parents and saying, hey, you left your father to die. And so she attacks him. He just clotheslines her with a shotgun. Then he goes, hey, Dodge, you know what? You gotta kill her with your bare hand. And so Dodge moves in for the kill, but then he mouths to Laura, run. And so Laura runs, hides, and then Dodge pulls out his Bowie knife, throws it at Malvern, tries to get him in the heart, but Malvern ducks and it gets it in the shoulder, and then Larson fucking shotguns him, and then Malvern pulls the knife out of his shoulder and then rams into Dodge's shoulder as payback. And then they take the veil and leave, and they shoot some grenades into the tunnel, which sets off earthquakes that are threatening to collapse the shrine. And so here we get the culmination of Laura's character arc about learning to, accept loss and make the jump. And so she's trying to get Dodge out, but he's going there's no time. You have to leave me. I don't want you dying too. And hey, there are worse places I could die. At least the last thing I see is all this gold and some fun stuff like that. And so she accepts the inevitable, and she has to jump over this chasm that's opened up. But so she so she's basically letting go of her fear. And she clambers out of the tunnel and watches as the helicopter flies away that the bad guys are in. And all right, so we're moving towards the end here. Gets into Dodge's seaplane, tracks down Malvern using a map of the shipping lanes, finds his ship, she sneaks aboard, she climbs up the anchor chain, goes into the below decks areas, down 2 floors. She finds a reinforced door with a radiation symbol, and then there's a goon comes through with a hazmat suit, knocks him out, steals his suit, and she enters the sealed area. Here's the really interesting twist here is that Malvern is using the veil to create weapons-grade plutonium and is auctioning it off to the highest bidder. I'm like, that is such a clever twist. I love that they have this object that can create anything you want. This guy is using it to make plutonium and sell it off so he can get rich. I think that's actually just I just think that's a clever twist on what they were going with. Like, he doesn't care about gold. Like, he wants something more valuable. And she grabs the veil to try and tries to run away, but Malvern, who's in like a viewing room on the other side of the plexiglass, he uses this safety feature to remove all the air from the room, and it starts suffocating Laura. So she goes into the cold storage room, and then she thinks, and she uses the veil to create liquid nitrogen, and she blows a hole in the wall to escape. And Malvern's like going like, how can there be a containment breach? What's going on? And so he goes down there, and she gets him, and she bashes open his hazmat suit and exposes him to radiation, going like, your trip home is going to be very painful. And so she tries to get out of there. She goes up to the decks. She goes up to the top deck, and she's looking at like boxes of plastic explosive, and I'm not really sure where the switch happens, but she apparently switches the veil into a different box, and she puts the plastic explosives into the case that she was going to put the veil in. I'm not really sure where this happens. It's not written as well as it could have been here, but she's like fighting her way across the top deck of this ship. Like, this one goon, like she ducks as this one goon shoots a harpoon line at her and impales this other guy behind her, and then she like cocks open the shotgun that she grabs from a guy, and she like zip lines down it to where the helicopter is parked. Larson chases her over there, and they're fighting inside the helicopter, like, and beating the crap out of each other, and the case keeps changing places. Then Malvern comes up from below decks and hooks the helicopter with another harpoon and is trying to reel it in. And as they're fighting, Larson grabs hold of the metal case, and Laura kicks him out, and then she like pilots it around, and like, it's weird how it's described. She uses the harpoon line to like smash the guy who's like manning the controls into the release lever, and that allows the helicopter to escape. And then Malvern opens up the case, and oh no, she pulled a switcheroo, and there's plastic explosives, and they go off, and this causes this huge nuclear explosion that she just manages to get away from. And I'm like, okay, that's pretty awesome. And so she gets home. It turns out that she's publicized, her findings about El Dorado, but she's given Dodge and Darby all the credit, which is kind of nice. She goes to Aunt Evelyn's party, and she shows up in this pretty dress, which is the only thing from this that really makes its way into the movies, because there's that weird gag about how like she won't wear the dress. At the end of the movie, she randomly wears the dress like it's meant to mean something. So here she shows up at Aunt Evelyn's party, and she says, hey, here's the paperwork I signed, and also I want you to keep this. And she gives her the veil to put in her collection of trinkets as like a callback to earlier. And it's also mentioned that she has the Scion and the Dagger of Chion, which is from Tomb Raider 1 and 2, which is a weird reference to make. And then she goes and has her drink with the Gadget Boys, and they're still annoying and they still suck. And that's the end of the script. I can say on the whole, I actually thought the script was pretty decent. It's not the greatest thing in the world, and it's not perfect. Like, I would change up the origin story a bit. I'd get rid of the Gadget Boys, and I'd like trim things down, maybe make the villains a little more threatening. Like, Larson is weird because like he's this big badass mercenary who sits around reading Cosmopolitan and like reading like the weird like sex advice out loud. Like, that's all strange. And I would cut out the training exercise and stuff like that. But I think, and maybe flesh out the relationship with Dodge a little bit more. But I think on the whole, this script could have been decent with a little more work. Now, according to Brent Friedman, with this script, like, there was like some divided reactions to it. Like, the studio people at Paramount really liked it, but the producers who were in charge, Lawrence Gordon and Lloyd Levin, they didn't like it and told him to come up with more economically viable ideas. And so he was trying to balance those two responses. But then Core Design, who had approval over scripts, they vetoed it without saying why. I don't know what their reasons would have been, because I think it would have been a decent sort of take on what Lara Croft was. Like, yeah, they gave her like some vulnerability and gave her a tragic backstory and stuff like that, but it makes her a deeper character. But yeah, they turned it down, and that's that for this draft. All right, so after Friedman's draft was rejected, the producers next went to a TV writer. It was Sarah B. Cooper, who most notably, she was one of the writers on Star Trek The Next Generation on the episode which introduced the Cardassian species, who would become a big part later on of pardon by cracking my water bottle there, but they'll become a big part of Deep Space Nine and a big part of Star Trek as a whole. And so she comes on and writes a draft sometime in late 98, early 99, not really sure when exactly. Well, actually, based on what I read, it would have to be sometime between Friedman's draft in July and when the next writer was hired, which we'll talk about in a minute. But hers was rejected, and I don't know anything about it other than that she was hired and then rejected. Other than that, eventually her name ended up on the actual first movie as a story credit. And so I'm kind of wondering what elements from that kind of ended up in the movie. And maybe it was something which two different writers sort of hit on the same idea at once, and so she got credit just kind of by coincidence. Because I mean, who knows what it is, because I mean, most of the writers who are credited on the movie really have nothing to do with the movie's story. That was pretty much just Simon West, which I'll talk about. But now that's an interesting thing to think about. And so her version struck out, and I don't really know why. Maybe it was core design again, like what happened with Friedman's draft. So the producers decided they were in a tight pinch, and so they needed to, bring the big guns essentially, or else they might not get the movie made. So they called up Stephen E. Souza, who had worked with Lloyd Levin and Lawrence Gordon many times before in the past with 48 Hours and stuff like that. So they brought him in to work on the script. And according to him, he was brought in September of 98, and he had a whole deal for an outline, a treatment, a draft, and a revision. And he says he turned in his final draft and revision in March of 99. Now, the draft I have is dated early February, so February 5th to be specific. So unless he was mistaken, he wrote one more draft after this, or one more revision. So, okay, now to get into this script, the basic overall plot is that after, a brief little setup introducing the villains and how they're picking off the people who were involved in this thing called the Iskander expedition from 10 years before, one of whom was a very young Lara Croft. We get introduced to Lara Croft, who is in the Balkans, and she in Macedonia, and she acquires what is supposed to be the death mask of King Philip of Macedonia, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And so she takes it back home. She finds out about all the people on the expedition that are being killed, and it's made to look like accidents. And while the thing is being unveiled at the museum, she gets met by the ambassador from this former Soviet nation called Kafiristan. And I'll talk about that later as to why that's kind of a weird choice here. And he tells her that like they thought they had found the sarcophagus of Alexander, but they actually hadn't, and that maybe the tomb is still there, and that she has to go find the clues because, to keep bad people from finding what might be there, which they speculate is the contents of the Library of Alexandria, which the script posits was not destroyed in a fire, but instead the main scrolls were taken away and hidden in Alexander's tomb when he died. As that happens, this group of guys break into the museum and steal the death mask, and they're led by this Texan named Larson, who I understand is from the game. And so Lara essentially is in a race against time against this guy to go find the clues and find Alexander's tomb in the library before they can. And that's a pretty good setup for a Tomb Raider story, I think. Let's see how it executes it. I won't give away my thoughts on it. I mean, I am a fan of Stephen E. Souza as a writer. I loved the Isobar script I covered in January. And in between that and the February episode, I read his Commando 2 script, which granted was revised by Frank Darabont, but was still a very good script. Could have done with some trimming in the first act to get the story structure down a little neater and get, make it a pacier kind of action movie. But it was overall a pretty solid story with some insane action, especially in that second half. But to jump into this first draft, I want to talk about some technical things first. First off, the title page is yellow, and I don't know if that was just a color coding thing that the production company was doing, or if it was like a copy protection thing, but it's irritating to look at. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see it in the thumbnail. I mean, it just sticks out like a sore thumb. It's one of the very few times I've seen a colored title page. I mean, I've seen I've seen it in a few other places. I don't think I've seen a banana yellow one before. Yeah, and like I mentioned before, it's the second draft dated February 5th, 1999. And then the second page is something I don't really care for. It's an outline of all the different locations that are visited in the script in the order that you see them. And to me, that kind of deflates the surprise of finding out where she goes in the script. Like, it would be nice just to read it and see what happens. And I don't know why he did that. Maybe it was just to sort of, give a quick cheat sheet for the producers so they can pretend like they read it, which I understand happens. And then the third page, pardon me, sorry, I'm a little sick this week, but is a poem called The Library of Alexandria by Jorge Luis Borges, if I'm pronouncing that right. Clearly, de Souza is a fan of this guy because he referenced him directly in his Isobar script, where the monster was named the Boromez, which I think is a silly name for a monster, but whatever. And so we get into the story, and it starts on Mount Chachapoya, Peru, in the Andes Mountains. And we're introduced to... We see a couple of native guides climbing up the mountain complaining that, this British woman that they've been hired by is crazy and that she wants them to climb up too high at this time of year. And then it's like, hey, she pays well, though. And there's this big reveal of her coming up and then taking her hood down, and you're meant to think she's Lara Croft, but it turns out she's this woman named Lady Priscilla Fenwick, whom... I don't know if that's actually somebody or if de Souza is just being smug when he says, yes, it's her, Lady Priscilla Fenwick, like he's winking at the reader or something. But he's talking about, like, they're the first ones who have ever climbed the south face of this mountain. But then they see coming over the peak, they see this group of camouflaged mercenaries who shoot at the there's like an overhang that's hanging over where like the three people are, and it's covered in snow. And so they shoot the slope, and a bunch of snow falls down in an avalanche and kills them. And then they see that, like, what is the term for this kind of camera? It's the kind of camera that prints out a picture. I cannot remember the name of it off the top. I'm tongue tied now. I'm having a brain fart. Polaroid. It's a Polaroid camera. I think that's what it's called. And so they see it's laying on top of the snow, and they take the picture of them that's come out of it, and they burn it. And then they fly away, and the leader gets out his radio and signals and, like, calls someone and gives the code words. It is definitely a white Christmas, which is kind of silly, but whatever. It's Tomb Raider. It can be silly if it needs to be, and to a certain extent. And then it cuts to on the other side of the radio, or the satellite phone or whatever it is, there's a person. We don't see who they are. We just see a white gloved hand because they've been handling a stamp collection, and it says in the scene description that we're in England now. And they hang up the phone, and as this is going on, there's a news report from the BBC talking about how Priscilla Fenwick has died in an avalanche. Now, I have no fucking clue how they got the news that quickly in 1999. I mean, it's not exactly the internet age yet. And as he's pardon me, and this mysterious person pulls out a list, crosses off Priscilla Fenwick's name, and we see that the last name on the list is Lara Croft. And as we're watching the TV news report, a picture of all these people pulls up, and it's all the members of the Iskander expedition from 10 years ago. And there's this young, awkward-looking teenage girl with braces, and it's assumed that that's Lara Croft. That's the opening of this script, and I like it because it sets up the bad guys really well. It shows that they're clever and that they're unusual in their tactics and that they have some sort of vendetta against this Iskander expedition, and they want to wipe them all out and make it look like a curse, like it's the curse of Iskander that's killing them. Of course, Iskander is I believe it's the Arabic rendering of Alexander, therefore Alexander the Great. And they treat that like it's a reveal later on, but I already knew that. In fact, one of the many Alexandrias he built was later named Iskenderun. It's in very southern Turkey. But I like this idea because it shows them as being smart and that they're good at covering their tracks and making people know they weren't there. And it sets up this mystery of who is this person with the white gloves. Now, I kind of figured it out early on, but at the same time, it is still a very interesting, sort of way to open the movie. It's like it feels like Lara Croft might actually be in danger. Granted, I don't think this lasts very long, but I'll save that for later. And so that cuts to Lara Croft. She's exploring a cave, and she gets surrounded by a pack of wolves, and then she runs away, leaps over a chasm. And also right before this, she was filming, and it's like implied that she has like a Discovery Channel program or something, or I couldn't tell if she was joking about that or not, but she has to drop her camera while she's climbing down into the cave. But so she jumps over the chasm, and even though she's away from the wolves, and I don't see a bunch of wolves jumping over a wide chasm to try and get to one person. I just don't see it. They don't even do that shit in the video games. She decides to throw 2 things of tinned beef over the chasm, shoot them in midair so the meat scatters, and then the wolves start fighting each other over the meat, and she gives off a really cringy one-liner where she says, "Lunch plan B, better you than me." And yes, the lunch plan B thing comes back later, and I can't even remember what it meant. It was just kind of silly. It's like, really, why are you giving one-liners to a bunch of wolves? They can't understand what you're saying. And throughout this whole thing, she's given off one-liners, and I can only remember another one off the top of my head, but I'll talk about it. This whole sequence, I mean. And so she's going through the cave, she's dodging blade traps, and she finds like some symbols, which are described as like a triangle with the all-seeing eye in it, the compass and ruler of the masons surrounding it, and she finds like the different symbols separate, and that leads her into the burial chamber, which is presumed to be of King Philip, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense later on. But she's there, and it's already been ransacked, but she finds like this hidden niche in the wall, and she finds the death mask, and then she looks up and sees a light, and I guess it opened up just then because she could have saved herself some time just by rappelling down there. But so she shoots out a grappling gun because she's Batman now. I just quoted Deus Deacon's review of Van Helsing, which there's going to be a lot of Deus Deacon quoting in this, because there's so many bits of this just made me think of him. She climbs up out of there, and she's in the middle of a Balkan war zone, and for some reason, even though nobody could hear her, she says, "Bloody Balkans, I should have made a left turn at Albuquerque." And I'm just imagining Deus Deacon going, whose benefit was that for exactly? And that was not meant to be an impersonation. I kind of tried to do a British accent, but fuck it. And it's just annoying. Not only are the one-liners not very good, but she's just saying them randomly and not even talking to people. And then she gets attacked by some thugs so we can have an action scene. She smacks one of them in the nuts with the golden mask and says it's a real ball breaker, which, okay, that's an okay one-liner. It's not great. In fact, why do all female action heroes have to have like an emasculating one-liner thrown in there? That's such a cliche now. But so she's fighting them, and she takes out the last one by flashing her tits and then distracting him, which is like, okay. It's not like we get to see them because they were apparently very insistent on making this a PG-13 from what I've read, but oh well. And then that cuts, and she's back at Croft Hall, and she's greeted by 2 members of Scotland Yard named Bryce and Denton barely says anything. And in this and I only mentioned him now because it becomes important later. Pardon me again. And we also meet Laura's goofy Aunt Gwendolyn, who's her mother's sister. And she's not too bad in this scene. She's just kind of there. And then she keeps coming back, and she is horrible. And I'll mention some of her later appearances, but most of them aren't really worth mentioning, to just repeat the same unfunny joke a lot of the time. But she gets shooed out of the room, and Denton gets shooed out of the room, and then Bryce starts talking to Lara about how all the different members of the Iskander expedition have been killed, and it looks like accidents. And it talks about how Sir Roger Ackroyd, because apparently de Souza is an Agatha Christie fan, his yacht blew up in the Caribbean. This other member, I can't quite remember his name, he got trampled to death by his own horse. And then of course you have Lady Fenwick in the Avalanche, and so he's saying, hey, we'd like you to stay in the country and use you as bait to draw these people out. And of course Laura is like, fuck that, I don't stay in this country for very long, even though I'm English. And so that basically is what happens. And there is a bit of a spark of attraction between them. And there is this sort of, not quite a romantic thing, but they kind of touch on it a little bit, and it doesn't go anywhere for reasons, which I'll get to later. But it is generally well set up throughout this. And so that night she attends the public unveiling of the death mask. And one of the things I like about this scene is that she's talking to the museum people, and she's saying, hey, you should have sent this to the lab first before you put it on display. You should have tested it for all these things. Heck, we don't even know if it is a death mask or if it was related to King Philip. And I like that because it shows that Lara is, even though she is a little unorthodox in her methods, she is very much an archaeologist, and she cares about the science, and she cares about doing things right. She cares about the culture. I think that's a good. And so Bryce shows up kind of tailing her there, and the ambassador from Kafiristan, which is a country which has just gotten, its independence from I was almost about to say the United Kingdom, the USSR, the former Soviet Union. He meets with her and talks to her about the Iskander expedition and how they really went there under the ruse of being archaeologists, and they stole the sarcophagus that they thought was of Alexander. from a temple, and apparently Laura's not proud of that because she didn't know they were going to do that. And so they're talking, he tells her that, oh, by the way, they ran DNA tests on the sarcophagus, and no one ever actually was in it, not even Alexander. And I don't know why Laura doesn't know this, like why the museum people didn't tell her this. Really is quite weird, and they're like off in like a separate wing of the museum from where the unveiling's going on. He's talking to her saying that, oh, they found he says that, oh, the tomb hasn't been discovered, and they found a letter from like one of Alexander's friends to Alexander, I think, and says that, oh, like we're moving something here, we're gonna put something in your tomb, and we went to the island of Avoya to talk to your old tutor, who would be Aristotle. And basically the implication being that Aristotle helped design the tomb, and if they go to Avoya and look for, where Aristotle was living, they can find a clue to where to look for the tomb. And once again, this is a very interesting idea. And they also mentioned that, oh, probably the thing he's talking about is the contents of the Library of Alexandria. And he fears that they may contain, the ambassador says that he fears that the library may contain knowledge of dangerous lost technologies, such as the mirrors that Archimedes used to drive off the Roman fleet. Now, hold on for a second, because this is fucking stupid. Archimedes fighting off the Roman fleet happened a century after Alexander died. Like, just takes a quick Wikipedia reference, or if you have enough knowledge to research that all this stuff about Alexander and how he and certain things, and like his tutor was Aristotle, and all about the Library of Alexandria, and that he did end up in the region known as Kafiristan, you should know that Archimedes lived later than Alexander, but oh well. And it's an interesting setup. And here's where the weird thing happens, that Kafiristan is a region in what is now Afghanistan. And yeah, it was, and like, the Russians did invade and stuff. It was never actually part of the Soviet Union. And it's weird here that it's made as like its own nation that's like independent. And like, I don't know if it even would have the population necessarily, but I can accept this level of fictionalization. I can't accept the Archimedes thing because it's stupid. I'll give the Souza that Kafiristan in this universe became its own country. I'll give him that. Now, later on, I'll call bullshit. That's for later in the script. And Laura promises to help him. While this is going on in the display room, a bunch of masked men led by this man with a Texan accent whom they call Larson in the script before his name is revealed. They crash into the party and they start to rob everyone. And they take only, small items that aren't particularly known, but they also grab the mask. And when Laura runs into the room to see what's going on, they try and shoot at her and she shoots back. And there's actually this cool bit here where they where Bryce kills one of the guys and she wounds one, and so Larson, as the rest of the guys are getting away, he shoots the wounded ones and kills them so that they can't reveal any information. Once again, shows shows the bad guys as being clever. And this is then almost immediately undone when Bryce is like, well, they made the other deaths look like accidents. They must decide to rob the place and then shoot you and say it was an accidental, like, ricochet or something. And I'm like, so they went through all this trouble, blowing up a yacht, causing an avalanche, making a guy's horse trample him to death, and their idea for Lara Croft is rappel in through the window and shoot wildly while actually shooting at her and then kill her and say it was an accident. Kind of deflates them a little bit, and that only gets worse as this thing goes on, sadly. And also you're wondering, hey Bryce, how do you figure that out? Like, you don't know what they're thinking, and you might be able to guess a plot twist now. And so Laura in this apparently runs a publication called Extreme Press. That's like an extreme sports thing. And so she goes to the office and she starts recruiting people for the expedition to go to the island of Avoya to check out Aristotle's crib or whatever. And she picks her right-hand guy, Seth, a climber named Ivan, and a diver named Anzac. And there's these two people she passes over named Mary Sunshine. I am not kidding. Mary, Merry, which just makes me think Pippin's gonna fucking show up. She's like some girly girl who's also a hiker or whatever, but Laura sends her away, and then there's this French guy who's being a dick, so she sends him away, named Pierre. And then there's this weird shifty man in a bowler hat that she decides to beat up for no reason. But it turns out he's a notary who's bringing government documents to her, and it turns out that the Foreign Office that Scotland Yard has revoked her passport. And so Laura goes, crap, she needs to pull some strings. So she goes to her Uncle Philip, who's taken the title of Lord Croft after her parents died, and they say later on it's a plane crash, but we don't get that till nearly the end. And so she's talking to him, they're chatting, they don't get along. Like, he's like, okay, he's like, I'm happy you have Croft Manor. I'd rather live in, or Croft Hall in this draft. I'd rather live in London and bang my model girlfriends. And she goes like, and he's talking about like, hey, you like to travel around the world and give important artifacts. And these are his words, whatever Wog asks for them. And I'm like, okay, so he's very British and very racist. And so he makes a deal with Laura to let her go to reinstate her passport, pull the strings to do that. But as long as she allows whatever artifacts she finds to be in the British Museum for at least a year, and he tries to make it 2 years, but then she tries to blackmail him but then she decides to blackmail him by saying that one of his girlfriends was underage. And I'm like, really? That's just weird. And so he arranges that. Laura goes back to Croft Hall to pack for the trip, and we start talking to Aunt Gwendolyn starts talking again. She's talking about like, oh, you should really get into cryptozoology. That's you should get your name there. And all this is there for is to set up this stupid, irritating, unfunny running joke about abominable snowmen, which just keeps coming up. And then Monty, Laura's tech guy, who might be the butler, I'm not sure. He's looking at like a digital picture of the mask, and so he finds an inscription on it. And there's like all these different things mentioned in the poetry, including these Greek mathematical ideas. And so she looks at the picture and realizes that the mask is a terrain map, which shows the location of the tomb. But there's like this one blank bit, which doesn't have any features. And also it's measured out in cubits, so it's too small of an area to look for on the world map. And I'm like, well, why don't you just look at the map of Kafiristan? It's some tiny, out-of-the-way former Soviet country. I'm sure you could probably find it if you looked hard. But what do I know? I'm a bear. I suck the heads off fish. And so Laura and her team, they're at Heathrow Airport, and they're about to leave. It turns out the favor that her uncle got from Scotland Yard came for catch, and so Bryce shows up saying he has to come along. And so he says Seth and Ivan have these minor prior offenses, so they can't come along. And so he makes Mary Sunshine, and Pierre come along. And this is just annoying. It's like, oh, two characters who were annoying comedy bits earlier, they're going to come along for the rest of the script. And guess what? For most of it, they say and do absolutely nothing. Granted, when I first started reading this, I was like, what's the point? But there is a point to it later, which I'll get to. So they arrive in Greece and they're making their way to Avoya, and Laura's giving the exposition saying that they're looking for the villa where Aristotle lived and where Alexander visited him to get the design for the tomb. But that section of the island sank during an earthquake, so they're going to have to dive. And she won't take the experienced diver with her because Bryce feels like he has to run the show, so he has to go with her. So they dive down with a special submersible that can take like photographs in different spectrums. And so they find his study. The submersible it takes infrared photographs of the long covered frescoes along the walls. And as they're about to leave, Bryce gets snagged by a very big octopus, and so they distract him with the shiny face mask and make it sink by giving it the weight belt. And then they almost run out of the weight. They almost run out of air on the way back up because the fucking entrance collapsed and they have to bash their way through, and they start giving mouth to mouth, and oh boy, more sexual tension, which is granted decently written. And so the infrared scan of the frescoes, it shows Aristotle handing the tomb plans to Alexander, which is the mask, apparently, and treasure and scrolls being loaded on a ship. And being offloaded for Aristotle are Siberian white tigers, which they're found in Siberia, and they're also found on this thing called the Kafiristan Escarpment. This whole section where she goes diving, all she finds out is that Alexander brought Aristotle things from Kafiristan when she already knew she had to go to Kafiristan. All it did was narrow down the area, which she could have done with some decent map checking. You see where the script is kind of starting to lose me? Well, it starts to lose me almost immediately after this because, okay, this clue leads Lara and the team to Kafiristan, and they stop just over the border in the former Soviet city of Baku, where they stay at this place called Zabul's Inn, and there's this weird ethnic stereotype guy named Zabul. Okay, here's a problem. This is where I'm giving de Souza's fictional geography, I'm just going to give it the works now, because there is a former Soviet city called Baku in Azerbaijan, and it's nowhere near Kafiristan. It's not like the very quick river trip they take in a minute. So, in the words of Nicolas Cage from Deadfall, bullshit. Just had to do that. And I might have to do that one more time. And so they're staying at the inn, and then Larson and his guys show up. Right before that, Lara meets an old, associate of hers named Kincaid, who's a less successful professional adventurer who's leading White River tours up the river, like White River rafting tours up the river, and they're talking, and he's like a drunk. And then Larson and his guys show up, and they have like a Mexican standoff, which ends with Mary and Pierre, who are at the hot tub that's apparently in this bar. They pull laser-sighted pistols on them, and so they lose the fight. And Lara's like, hey, we want to watch these guys. Hey, you, Pierre, you stay up and you watch the gear. Yeah, they watch the gear. And then early next morning, like 3 a.m., Lara wakes up and, oh crap, their Land Rovers are on fire. And Pierre comes walking out of a room with his sleep bag, goes, hey, what happened? And Lara just starts beating the fuck out of him, going like, you're an idiot. And so she turns away. He pulls a knife. Then Bryce just shoots him dead. And Lara's like, hey, you asshole, I was going to shoot the knife out of his hand. He goes like, you couldn't have moved that fast. I'm like, wow, Pierre, you're an idiot. And apparently Pierre is the name of like, okay, in the original game, there was like the evil like henchmen were led by Larson, who was a Texan. So it's basically this guy. And there was a French guy named Pierre who was always running away. Yes, I know. Because he's French. So I'm guessing this is kind of a reference to that guy. And Larson is definitely a reference to that guy. Unlike in the last script where Larson was just some dude. All right, they don't have the cars, and so because Larson is taken off and they're going to drive away and they're going to beat them to Kafiristan, she goes, hey, Kincaid, let's take one of your rafts and go upriver. And so they do, and this scene, like, it's supposed to be exciting, but it's just people taking a raft up a river and having to deal with rapids and stuff. Like, at least the way it reads, it's not terribly exciting. It just, oh, they get swept aside fast and Anzac almost falls out. And then they have to, like use like momentum to pull him back in. And I'm like, it just doesn't read that exciting. It feels very perfunctory. It doesn't help that I'm sitting here wondering, like, okay, you needed an expert diver for the Aegean, which, okay, you didn't actually need to go there, but whatever, in my opinion. Why are you bringing, it's mentioned he has a false leg. Why are you bringing the one-legged, experienced diver to go climb some mountains in fictional Afghanistan? Am I the only one who thinks that doesn't compute? But whatever. And so like at the last minute, it's like, oh no, Larson stopped to chop down a tree and block the river. And so they have to like use their momentum to go over like a ramped rock and like go over it. And they actually break one of the air passages on it as they go over it. But that doesn't make a difference. It's just not that great of an action scene. And then Larson is checking the tree with the binoculars, and because he sees like the bit of rubber hanging from like one of the branches on it, he's like, oh boy, they must be dead. But then he spots Lara and company. They're climbing up the escarpment and like they're like closer to him than he thought. And it's like, oh no. And then like they're climbing and Kincaid takes a rest out of sight on a ledge. He's about to take a drink and a smoke, but he thinks better of it and just leaves them there and gets back to the job. So it's like, okay, this guy's definitely a straight arrow. He's going to stop drinking alcohol today because drinking alcohol is bad. And so they get to the top, and Bryce opens up the steel case that has the communications equipment in. He says it's been destroyed. It was while Kincaid was carrying it. And maybe he's trying to sow discontent, but Lara's too stupid to figure it out. And meanwhile, Heinrich, who's the scientist working for Larson, it's implied that he's the son of a Nazi. He might even be a neo-Nazi. Like, it's really weird because this character's barely in it. He's examining the mask, and he finds a tiny face engraved in the mysterious blank spot, which is important later. And then while Lara's group are like hiking along, and Kincaid stands on one of the cases, and then Bryce opens it and goes, hey, the water purifier is broken. And so they think Kincaid is a saboteur. And so they do this thing where they tie him 10 feet up off the ground in a tree, and they leave him supplies because Lara knows he'll get out of those bonds in time. And he goes like, how can you do this, Lara? You're not the woman I knew. And here comes one of the worst fucking lines I have ever read in the script. No, he says, no, what he says is, how can you do this to me? And she goes, you're not the man I knew. And he says, and you're not the woman I knew, with a heart that wasn't just another muscle. That is a shitty line of dialogue. Holy crap. And this is from the guy who gave us Yippee-Ki-Yay, motherfucker. Or maybe that was ad-libbed, I don't know. But there was some good dialogue in Die Hard. There was good dialogue and good one-liners in The Running Man. And he gives us the woman who had a heart that wasn't just another muscle. Sorry, it's just distracting how bad that line is. And so that happens. And then later that night, Lara's on watch, and then Bryce shows up to relieve her, and they almost kiss. Or they do kiss, and then suddenly they hear Larson's vehicles moving around. And they get closer, and they're apparently at the top of like a cliff over top of where Lara and her group are, and they're piling boulders up to knock them over and kill them because, hey, they like to make deaths look like accidents, except the times when they tried to shoot them in the middle of a crowded inn, and the whole, we're going to pretend to rob the place and then shoot someone and claim it was an accident, even though we were clearly shooting at them, because apparently these guys are supposed to be clever. And so they see that, and so Bryce, by the way, has had this mysterious black case he's been carrying around. I won't say what's in it. So he opens it. There's a rocket launcher in it. He aims it, and he takes out the edge of the rock formation behind the vehicles, which takes them out, but it causes like a dirt slide, causing the boulders to slide down. And it basically kills everybody except for Larson. And like Anzac and Mary, they managed to get out of the way too. We see that. And so both Lara and Kincaid get beaten up by Kincaid's tapped in a tree. Bryce gets beaten up by the rubble, and he's knocked out. So Lara's carrying him in his case, and then out of his case pops some communications equipment. She's like, hey, you've been holding out on me again. And figuring he's just being secretive because that's what he's like. And so she uses it to call up the he mentioned, he's going to call they can call up a frequency and talk to Denton anytime they want to. And so she calls up the thing and gets Scotland Yard, and this guy gets on saying he's Denton, and then she realizes, oh wait, something's wrong. He's not the guy that she saw before. And then Bryce is like, you better step away from that, Lara. And he has a gun pulled on her. It turns out, bum, 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 Bryce is a bad guy. Yeah, I bet you could see that. And then the weird part is that also he destroyed the equipment to sow discontent and sow doubt in Lara's mind to get rid of Kincaid, because keeping one guy around you don't know is too bad. Well, okay, it cuts back to England, and the real Denton is visiting Lord Croft and informing him of the situation. And he tells him what happened. And he also says, by the way, the signal got relayed from a different location before it came to us. So that means that, whoever it was not at Scotland Yard. And then after that guy leaves, Croft gets into his I think it's his rolls, and he talks to his driver, and he starts talking about how, like, oh, hey, he's been on it this whole time, and that if she gets to the library first, then it's going to be in the hands of soft-hearted scientists instead of real men who can use that information to rule the world. So yeah, he's the big bad of the movie, and the fake Denton is his driver. And okay, that twist is a decent twist. However, what happens with him is just pointless, because he heads off for Croft Hall, and that's the only place he goes. Oh yeah, that's a thing. And so Lara, she deduces based on some things that Bryce says that her uncle Lord Croft is actually part of the conspiracy. And so she manages to get away. She runs and she finds Anzac and Mary, but then they pull guns on her. It turns out that they were working for Bryce all along, and that when Bryce got rid of those two other guys, he was trying to make the team consist of only people who worked for him. And I'm like, okay, you set up Larson's expedition. He has the gold mask. And he has a scientist working on it who can figure this shit out. Why do you need Lara alive? And if you wanted to find out what the clues were at the bottom of the Aegean at Avoya at Aristotle's crib, you could have found that out, figured out what she meant, and killed her, dumped her body in the ocean, and you would have had no competition and you would have won. But instead, they keep up this charade and try to kill them with an accident. It's like, and I don't even know at the end of the day why they even bothered with the Iskander expedition, because it turns out that the clue they needed, Lara Croft found it and then they stole it. I don't know why they needed to kill everybody else involved. Like, why couldn't they just steal it and they wouldn't have known the difference if they didn't send their guy to tell Lara Croft about what was going on, so she wouldn't have suspected anything. So the mask could have gotten stolen and they could have been on their merry way, and none of this would have happened. So yeah, these villains, they suck, and they only get worse. And this weird thing happens, right? So Lara's captured, they knock her out, they make a cage and tie her up inside it. And they have this weird thing, because like it's been built up for a while now that they can hear the roaring of the white Siberian tigers, which shouldn't fucking be in Afghanistan, but whatever. At least I don't think they should be. And he's like, we're going to bring in a torture expert or something. So they leave a trail of blood. I'm not sure whose blood. And they hide, and they like have the cage attached to like a rope, and they're up in a tree platform where the tiger won't see them. And so the tiger comes in. Their plan is that apparently if this tiger gets near enough to Lara, eventually she will get scared and her mind will psychologically break and she'll cooperate. And then they start doing this thing where they start lifting the cage and the tiger starts batting at the cage and sticks its paw in. So Lara wraps her wrist bonds around around the tiger's paw and keeps it trapped, and the weight is too much for them to hold, so they all fall out of the fucking tree. And so there's some stuff with Lara. She avoids the tiger. She scuffles with Bryce for a bit, and then she jumps to the other side of a ravine, or to the bottom of a ravine or something. Mary's down there with her and starts fighting her because we need to have a girl fight. And then Lara almost gets killed, but then Kincaid shows up at the last minute and brains her with a rock. So I'm assuming she died. And they find a limb, so they're assuming Anzac got torn to pieces by the tiger, which has to have happened because we don't see him again. And so it's like, why did we bother with these characters? They're boring. They don't do anything useful aside from like occasionally talk to Lara and provide advice, and then they turn on her, which is supposed to be a shocking twist. They're just boring, pointless characters. And Anzac doesn't even get an on-screen death, and he was one of the most interesting of the bunch, who was rendered completely uninteresting by turning him into a bad guy. And so Lara and Kincaid, they cross the desert, and they get closer to the area marked as blank on the mask. Turns out Bryce has survived as well, and we see him kill the tiger because, ooh, he's evil, he killed an animal, and then Larson shows up and holds him at gunpoint, and we don't know what happens with him until like the last 2 pages. And yeah, have you noticed just how little of interest they've seen in this is like the last half of the script? They're at a fairly generic seedy bar, they go up a river, climb a cliff, walk through a forest, and walk across a desert. There's no real adventure going on here. It's like the river kind of counted and the rock climbing kind of counted, but this maybe if it was directed well, this could have like been something. It just doesn't read very well. So while this is going on, Croft and the fake Denton, they go to Croft Hall and they cut the phone lines. And so they're entertained by Gwendolyn for a while, but Monty, he cuts the power, and that's when Gwendolyn realizes something bad has happened. And so she leaves the room to go looking for the fuse box, and so she gets in contact with Monty, who says, hey, he saw them outside on the security camera. You know, he saw them conspiring, so he knows they're bad. And so Gwendolyn, she offers to, because like, I think Croft asks to see Lara's computer, so Gwen's like, hey, I'll show it to her, and takes him up to her old bedroom and shows her this old, like, Apple IIe, I think, and it's like, really? You're gonna use that joke? And so there's, like, bits of Croft paging through this thing, trying to find the information he's looking for, and he finds, like, Wolfenstein 3D on there. Why are you making that joke? Pardon me. In this Tomb Raider script, it's such a weird choice. And then Croft, of course, he figures out that there must be a fourth nearby, and he told Denton before he went off to Lara's room. He said, hey, check the outbuildings, look for a fourth person. And so Denton finds where Monty's hiding out in the attic of the carriage house, and he garrots him. Don't worry, he's not dead. And then Lara and Kincaid, they come across these stacks of 100,000 bronze shields, which apparently have not tarnished at all in the thousands of years since Alexander was buried. And apparently no one noticed this big shiny thing on the side of a cliff before. And so they climb up past that area and they find a rock face which looks just like the face on the death mask. Okay, I have to ask about this death mask. All right, so the plan for the location of the tomb was carved into the death mask, and you find out that the text that was on the mask was the solution to the various riddles. So who took this mask, went up to Macedonia, went down into a cave into a tomb, which may or may not have been King Philip's tomb, even though the list of locations at the beginning says it is, and just dumped it in a hidden niche? Like, who went out of their way to do that? Like, which person in Alexander's retinue did that? Like, okay. I don't really understand that, but okay, so they're sitting in front of this water pool, and then Lara realizes that this reference to a specific character from a Greek play who would have been a certain weight, so she piles a bunch of rocks up next to Kincaid and makes, this shaft open up. And so they go down the shaft, and they find this room called the Sphinx Room, and they push a button, and it opens a door, and there's this mosaic floor made up of, like, different amounts of, like, sun rays, and it's 4 rays, then it's sets of 4, then sets of 2, and then a set of 3. And she realizes, oh, hey, it's the riddle of the Sphinx. And I'm like, so much for the genius of Aristotle. Ultimate riddle which you need to solve to get into this area with the wisdom we hid away, apparently for a reason that's never explained. We're going to lock it up with a riddle that is the riddle everybody knows. Man, Aristotle must have been going fucking senile when he came up with this idea, I swear. And so they have to go on all 4s across the mosaic, then they have to go on 2s, then they have to, like, tie themselves together like it's fucking potato sack race to get across the 3, because, the 3-legged, because, walks with 3 at sunset or whatever. And so they get into the tomb, which seems pretty easy, and then they find Alexander's sarcophagus with a sword in his hand, in the stone hands on the. It's a gold sarcophagus, but whatever. And then there's the library, which is stacked in the wall in such a way as to make a map that shows not only, the old world that Alexander would have known, but the Americas, as well as Atlantis and Mu, because we have to throw that in there. And there's also 2 really big statues at the other end of the room, which they call Gog and Magog after one of the poems on one of the inscriptions on the mask. We cut back to Croft Hall, and Gwen cuts the power entirely to try and make a break for it. And then Denton and Croft split up to look for her, and then Gwen knocks out a fake Denton with a croquet mallet or something like that. And then she gets cornered by Croft, and he says something about a wrench in an airplane engine. She goes, "Oh hey, you killed Laura's parents." And I'm like, wow, that's such a tacked on last minute reveal. It's almost as tacked on as the reveal in the actual movie, except there was build up to the fact that her father was missing. It's still tacked on that Paolo was the one who killed him, but there's build up. Yeah, I'm complimenting the movie over this script, which is weird. And he's about to, he's got Gwendolyn in his arms. He's about to kill her. Then, oh hey, Monty apparently was saved by this neck-mounted headset he's wearing. Then he shows up and sprays Lord Croft in the face with insecticide, presumably killing him. He falls back into the flowers. Yes, our big bad of this script has to chase down an old woman and gets killed with fucking insecticide. Okay, so we get back to the tomb. Kincaid takes the sword from Alexander's sarcophagus, and this makes the 2 statues start moving. Gog is spitting fire, and Magog has this big cycloptic mirror eye, which is supposed to be the mirror of Archimedes, which, based on some of the things I read about this draft before I read it, I thought that was supposed to be the big MacGuffin, it was supposed to be this big super weapon that Alexander hid in his tomb to keep people from getting it because it was too dangerous. No, it's just there. They don't make any big deal out of it. The whole idea there being knowledge there that, people maybe shouldn't have, never touched on. Nothing's done with it. Apparently, Alexander hid all the scrolls there because he didn't want anyone else reading his shit. He's just a selfish little nerd. But okay, so they're hiding from the 2 statues behind the sarcophagus, and Laura gets this idea. She takes Kincaid's lighter because she says, hey, there must be a bunch of fuel inside this thing, and then throws it into its mouth, and that makes it explode, and it explodes into Magog, knocking it down. And so they take all of the scrolls, which it can't be that many because they stuff them into tiny little backpacks. And apparently all the traps in the antechamber have been set off, so they have to dodge them, and they climb out of the shaft, only to be met by Bryce and Larson, who apparently gave up on all their animosity in between the last time we saw them and now. And so Kincaid is fighting Larson, and he tries to knock him down into the shaft and kill him. And he goes, hey, I know better than that. And then he somehow manages to flip himself down the shaft and die like a fucking moron. So that villain sucked. And Bryce almost kills Lauren. He's like, I thought you fancied me. He's like, not as much as I fancy cash. And then Magog, who's still alive, bursts up through the ground, grabs Bryce and kills him, and then falls back down. And then, as Kincaid and Laura are leaving, that place collapses, and they're chatting, and he says, hey, lose my number, and she goes, I have too good of a memory. And then they see this rescue chopper, which was mentioned earlier when the Scotland Yard guy went to visit Lord Croft. He mentioned something about they have an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, but the chopper won't get there for a while or something like that. And that's where it ends. It's so that's a De Souza draft. Honestly, I was expecting a lot more from this, given this is from one of the guys who gave us Die Hard, 48 Hours, The Running Man, among other things. But then again, I love the Isobar script. I love Commando, which he co-wrote. I really liked the Commando 2 script. But then again, in the 90s, he kind of fell off a bit. He gave us Hudson Hawk, fucking Judge Dredd, which I know the stuff that happened on Judge Dredd wasn't completely his fault, and he got kind of fucked over unfairly on that. And he wrote and directed Street Fighter with Van Damme, which once again was not completely his fault. I'm guessing his story wasn't that great to begin with, and Capcom fucking around with him didn't help either. And the cast getting a bunch of STDs from Thai hookers, and Van Damme doing coke and fucking his co-star. But yeah, it's starting to just give me this idea that maybe De Souza is only as good as the draft he's rewriting, or maybe he needs a strong collaborator. But yeah, this was just not good. Of course, the exception to that would be Judge Dredd, which was bad, even though he was rewriting someone else's script. But yeah, it's just disappointing. And he talks about it like, oh, it was so good, and then like the other writers screwed it up, and Simon West was an idiot. And I'm like, yeah, Simon West's idea for the movie wasn't very good either, but at least Powell was hilarious and hammy, and he doesn't get taken out by a fucking nerd with insecticide. He's not an idiot like Larson. He's not bland and pointless like Bryce, and his plans actually kind of make sense. Like, hey, he can't beat Laura, so he decides he's going to work with her and then screw her over. That makes sense. And at least with the MacGuffin in that, like, even though I don't really understand the stakes in that movie, at least there are some. The wrong people get a hold of, like, the power to control time. That could cause problems. This is just like, hey, it's a bunch of scrolls and some giant statue, which they probably wouldn't be able to fuck with because it would just kill them anyways. And not that I believe that these bad guys would particularly be able to do anything with it anyways, because they're fucking stupid. When they started off in the script really smart, that's a real disappointment. But anyway, apparently, according to Souza, everybody gave him positive notes on his script. Maybe the March version of this was better, unless he was mistaken. It was referring to this. And it basically got the project out of development hell, and Paramount decided, they were ready to start looking at directors. And Stephen Herrick, who did Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, he signed on to direct. And then the Souza script, they decided to rework it. And you hear Lloyd Levin talks about how he said that he had his misgivings, saying that they weren't really embracing the character and how contemporary she was. I don't know what he's talking about. And that they were just trying to fit into the preconceived mold of other movies. And oh yeah, by the way, I actually prefer the Friedman draft to the Souza draft. Yes, the co-writer of Annihilation, the Mortal Kombat movie, in my opinion, wrote a better Tomb Raider script than the co-writer of Die Hard. Go figure. But Lloyd Levin apparently wasn't overly impressed with the script, and Herrick apparently decided he had his own ideas, and so they decided to go with other writers who are less expensive than Souza, who was a heavy hitter. And Souza also speculates that maybe Herrick wanted a writer who wasn't, in the producer's camp like he was. But either way, it wouldn't have made a difference because he was busy writing and directing a TV movie at the time. And so they went to two writers whom their draft is not out there, but it's Patrick Massett and John Zinman, whom they were new screenwriters at the time. They had done a script for Lloyd Levin, and they were in his office, or Lawrence Gordon, whichever one, and they saw a life-size cutout of Lara Croft, and they said, hey, we might want to do this movie. And so they looked at the games, they came up with a plot, and apparently their draft was closely based on Souza's script. And one of the things they went on to do was they created Veritas the Quest, which was a show I remember liking when it was on, but it got killed by competition. It kept getting preempted by Iraq War coverage back in 2003, which is too bad because it was a pretty decent show. It was kind of an Indiana Jones light sort of thing, like Tomb Raider would be. It had Arnold Vosloo playing a badass, and I gotta go see if I can find that show and watch it again. But their draft, according to Souza, followed his draft in general, and it was the Alexander the Great idea hiding something away. But here, the MacGuffin was Achilles' shield, but it was still the idea that Alexander the Great found something dangerous and decided to hide it. Don't really get that idea from Souza's draft, so I don't know what he's talking about. And so they wrote it, and then they got replaced by the writers of Face Off, Mike Werb and Michael Colleary. And Werb before this had written, he got sole screenplay credit for a few other guys got story credit, but he got the screenplay credit for The Mask, and two movies I like quite a bit. And so they come in and write their version, and the version I took notes on was an outline that they wrote in October of 98, and just today, right before I decided to start recording, I found their full draft, and I decided, I want to get this done so I can focus on, early preparation for the anniversary episode. So I'll just continue to talk about the outline, and I'll mention some things from the expanded script that I know about from reading. I'm getting a lot of this information from Tales from Development Hell by David Hughes, like I did with Isobar. To just go up the outline, it says that so this outline dated 1998 by Werb and Colleary says that it's a prologue set in Macedonia in 323 BC in a cave on Mount Olympus. It says Alexander murdered, magical shield of Achilles is broken, and the pieces are scattered. Now, apparently, in the fleshed out version, Alexander has gone crazy from using the shield of Achilles. First of all, I'm just like, shield of Achilles, really? Didn't do Achilles much good, did it? Kind of a worthless artifact to chase, but whatever. But apparently it's supernatural or something. It's like a supernatural piece of armor. It's not really a shield. But apparently in their fleshed out draft, Alexander was driven insane by this and started sacrificing people. So some of his own people betrayed him and took him down and then broke the shield into pieces and sent it to the ends of the earth. Which you see that idea carried over into the first movie of breaking the triangle into pieces, and they say the pieces were sent to the ends of the earth. One was sent kind of far away, the other one stayed where it was. And so we get that, and then it says, it introduces Lara. She's stealing an ancient goblet from a casino in Vegas, and then she evades the police and flies back to London, where she sells the goblet to a buyer on the underground, and she's being followed by this mysterious American mercenary who's noted as being named Theo Rooker. Obvious red herring is obvious. Okay, this opening, at least as described in the outline, it's like, okay, so Lara's a thief, and she's selling it to some punk on the London Underground. Wow, I already don't like you. Now, apparently in the fleshed out version, she's like stealing artifacts back for their rightful owner, but why would someone who's the rightful owner of an ancient goblet be buying it back on the fucking subway train? Just like, okay. And then she donates the money to a children's hospital because we have to make her a good guy, and then the buyer is killed in the street by unknown assailants who steal the goblet. And so Lara, she works out at Croft Manor, and then she goes to the magazine office where she works, and there's apparently some girly conversation about she has with her boss, Kate, who asks her why she doesn't date, and she says, all the good men are scared of me or married. I'm like, do we need this fucking, like, rom-com Julia Roberts movie bullshit in a Tomb Raider movie? I say no. And so then she apparently has to go have tea with a friend. And she goes and has tea with the queen because in London, everything is all about the queen, tea, and core blimey governor. Thank you, Deus Deacon, for that line. Apparently she was a friend of her mother, and she's like semi-raised her since her parents' plane disappeared somewhere. And like Lara's like, oh, I don't believe she's dead. And as she's leaving the queen, she gets stopped and asked to meet with the Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, Lord Powell, whom apparently in the fleshed out draft, she is his uncle. He is her uncle, sorry. And he's this frail old man. And so she's in his office and she sees the goblet on his desk, and she should immediately go, why the hell do you have it? But she doesn't. And he introduces her to this Greek archaeologist named Darius, and he wants her to help to find the shield of Achilles. And now it was split into 3 pieces. One piece went to Sweden, and that's one which ended up in the goblet that she stole. And then the second went to Morocco, and the third went to Nepal. And it's not explained how, like, you go from goblet to shield piece, but I'm guessing that's explained in the fleshed out draft. And so she agrees because it was the thing her father was after, presumably when he disappeared. And you can see where this is going. And so she goes to her parents' empty crypt and meditates on her disappearance. And it says the empty crypt is symbolic of her empty soul or something like that. And I'm like, this is just silly. And so they go to Rabat, and Lara, who's translated the inscription on the first goblet using her father's journals, because apparently she doesn't know shit in this version, she just steals shit. And they find where the location is, but they find out that Theo Rooker is leading a rival dig. And so they're looking for a way to tunnel under them, and they determine that they're going to have to sneak into a U.S. embassy, and that there's a gala going on. So Lara goes and buys a dress for the occasion, gets attacked by Theo's men, getting away inside a large tire, which just sounds like a rather silly, overblown action scene. So Lara and Darius that night, they sneak into the embassy, tunnel through the floor for the nursery, swim through a watery tunnel, and enter the Tomb of Plagues, which is where the second goblet is. And while they're there, Theo's group also punches through. And that's when Darius double crosses Lara, kills Theo's second in command, and then runs off with the goblet and traps them inside. But right before he gets away, Lara snaps a picture of the goblet with her belt buckle camera, which apparently she has. So Theo, turns out he's a good guy working for the Greek government. They decide to work together. And so they find their way through the plague labyrinth where, like, apparently the laws of physics don't apply, and, like, they're walking on the ceilings and stuff, which would later get snatched and used in Cradle of Life. And apparently there's like all this stuff, weird stuff they're seeing where it's like hallucinogenic spores are causing it. So they get through, like most of the guys die except those 2. And in the last room, they get attacked by giant poisonous millipedes. And it says Lara uses all her assets to stop. And apparently, from what I know of the fleshed out draft, that means she crushes one with her cleavage. So basically, Lara gives deadly pizzerie to a giant poisonous millipede. You can thank me later in the comments for that mental image. I'm winking and giving the thumbs up like I'm Buddy Christ. Yeah, I don't know about that. That just seems like it's trying to be self-aware about Lara's character being a video game sex symbol. I'm not too sure about that. That just seems silly. Like, yeah, we gotta draw attention to the tits other than them just being there. Like, they'll draw attention by themselves. That's generally how tits in men's minds work. But whatever. And so because of what happens, they emerge in the embassy nursery, and because she dug through the floor, she gets arrested. But then the Greek government bails her out pretty quickly. And there's, of course, an action scene of her fighting people in the jail cell. So it turns out Laura's father's journal was stolen by Darius, and because she doesn't know shit, she can't decipher the inscription in the photograph. And they call Lord Powell and apprise him of the situation, and he agrees to help in any way he can. So, okay, big mistake, because you should already know he's a bad guy based on the fact that he has the goblet, but whatever. So Theo and Laura, they go to Srinagar, Kashmir. One Piece going to Nepal means they go to Kashmir, apparently. That doesn't make sense. They visit a monk who translates it with a computer, apparently, and that leads them to a place called the Temple of the Winds. And they take a quick stop to sabotage Darius's operation at his base camp. And then they arrive at the Temple of the Winds, which has been ransacked, but dun dun dun, Laura finds her father's signet ring. And she goes searching through the area to find where her parents are, and they go to a nearby village, and the villagers point them to a lake hidden in the valley. And she dives down, finds her parents' plane and their corpses, and the third shield piece, which is at the bottom of the lake. And so she swims up, and then a boat arrives, and Lord Powell's in the boat, and they're like, oh yay, but that turns out Darius is in the boat with him. Darius is his son. Apparently, Laura didn't know she had a cousin. Which maybe I think that changed in the full draft. I'll look at the excerpt from Hughes's book when I'm done here. But it turns out they've been in league to find the shield since the beginning. So Laura and Theo are subdued, and they're like chained up in some way. It's not really explained, and they're left to die. And like when they could have just killed them, I don't know why. And so she picks the locks with a pick she keeps hidden in her braid. Which admittedly, that's pretty clever that her braid serves a purpose. And then they pursue the bad guys, and they just miss them as they take off in the plane. And so they follow them in the only available craft, an old World War II fighter. And it turns out that Powell and Darius have flown to Greece and Alexander's tomb on Mount Olympus, which if it was on Mount Olympus, I'm pretty sure people would have found it by now. But so they're in the tomb, and they perform the ritual to make the shield whole again. It's really a mask, and Paolo puts it on, and his frail body becomes superhumanly strong, and he goes crazy. He sacrifices Darius, and like Laura, like she parachutes in from the plane, goes in, she starts fighting him, starts getting her ass kicked. Then Theo shows up, and they both start fighting him. And eventually, they stab him in the heel, I guess. I guess that's explained in the fuller draft. And so they kill him, and then Laura takes the shield and then casts it into the bowels of the mountain so no one can get it. Puts her parents in the crypt and says goodbye to Theo. And I like this twist. It turns out he's married and he has children, so he's not a love interest, which was a good move, especially after that stupid dialogue about her not dating. And then she says, oh, she's going to go for a vacation. It shows her diving in a sunken city, and the shark comes up behind her, and then she turns around, faces the camera, shoots a spear gun, and it fades to black. Pretty cool ending, I will say, and they kind of lifted that for Cradle of Life as well. This outline, without reading the full draft, is okay-ish. I'm not a fan of her stealing back objects for their rightful owners. I'd much rather her just go retrieve them from the ruins but just like hand them over to museums or something. I'd much prefer that. Like say like, oh, it was supposed to be in Sweden. Okay, she goes, finds the goblet in Sweden, gives it to a Swedish museum, and then when Powell has it on his desk, he just says, hey, I got them to give it to me. They owed me a favor, but it turns out he actually had it stolen. That would make more sense. And just stuff like, I don't need the shit with the queen drinking tea. Apparently that was one of the things that pissed off Simon West and why he decided to write his own version. And I can understand why that would offend an English person, not hanging out with Deistic and watching his reviews and stuff. I get it. But still, you could have written a better script, dude. You could have went back to, I don't know, Friedman's draft or the Souza's draft and just rewritten that and fixed the issues with it. Because you already did basically a page one rewrite anyways. But yeah, other stuff, like, I don't need her crushing millipedes with her tits. That's just stupid. And overall, there's just weird things I'm not quite sure make a whole lot of sense, which probably make a little bit more sense in the fleshed out draft, but I don't have time to read that. I want to get to work on the anniversary episode, make that as good as it can be. So yeah, that outline, it's okay. But my favorite of the three is probably still the Friedman draft, just because he clearly did his research on the El Dorado thing and put his own spin on it and did some clever stuff with the villain plan. And the villains in that were actually semi-competent, unlike the others. But yeah, just to sort of fill in the rest of the blanks with this, apparently in the final draft, instead of Darius, his name is Alexis Toulon, who works for the Greek Ministry of Antiquities, not related to Andre Toulon, the puppet master. And she has to stop Toulon and his evil wife, which I don't know what that means, or his dangerous wife. I don't know what that means in the context of the thing. And apparently it's explained in the full draft that Powell's in on it and he's dying and wants the breastplate so he can go on living. Apparently in the full draft it's a breastplate and not a mask, which makes more sense, I guess. But still, fat load of good it did to Achilles, eh? And also the name of Powell for the villain to make him this very British douchebag is that was carried over into the first movie. And so pretty much what happens is that draft was written and they didn't, and Stephen Herrick left for whatever reason. Let me see if I can find it. He left to go direct something else. Let me see if I can find it in the text. He left to direct Rockstar with Marky Mark. Wow, I haven't heard much good about that movie. And according to Souza, the draft spent a huge amount of time, like 28 pages in Ancient Times with Alexander. And he said, sort of like The Mummy. Okay, first of all, The Mummy doesn't spend that much time in ancient Egypt. If this interview happened later and he was talking about Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, he'd have a point. But the stuff you see in the prologue of The Mummy is all plot relevant and doesn't take that long. And I've looked at the draft. It spends all of... I glanced at the full draft before I started recording. It spends all of 7 pages in Alexander times. So DeSalza just has sour grapes about his draft being rewritten. So yeah, Herrick left to direct Rockstar and they were left without a director, so... And it would have been cool to see what he would have done with a Tomb Raider movie. I think his sense of style would have been neat. But then, so Paramount realized that they needed to get this off the ground quickly, so they went to Simon West, who was in the middle of development hell, making a movie of the Prisoner TV show, which wasn't going anywhere. So they basically kind of maneuvered him into taking on the Tomb Raider job. He decided he hated the script because of the shit about, drinking tea with the Queen and Corbelime Governor, which is understandable. So we looked at the drafts, looked at the Masset Zinman draft and said that was his favorite. So they apparently used that as the starting point, but I haven't read that, so I can't tell you what all of that made it into the actual movie. And so he cobbled together the script, and with him and Angelina Jolie, she came up with all the father-daughter stuff that's in the movie. And so they put together a script, and then Paramount brought in some finishers. Oh, here they are. Brandon Braga, oh boy. The man who gave us Technobabble and fucking Threshold. Laeta Kalogridis, who wrote that interesting Bride of Frankenstein script I talked about, as well as Shutter Island and other things. And Paula Tanzio, who's a fairly well thought of writer. They brought them in to basically whip this script into shape, basically. And then, so that basically was how the first Tomb Raider got made. And then they ran the budget cuts, and so a whole bunch of shit got cut out, and so the plot didn't make any sense. And so the film was a cobbled together mess, as what happens when a director writes a script cobbled together from other drafts and he gets an adaptation credit. So yeah, when you see an adaptation by credit on the writing scripts for a movie, in the writing credits for a movie, that usually means there's some sort of fuckery going on behind the scenes. Another example would be with Big Trouble in Little China. The script they used was really written by W.D. Richter, but the Writers Guild pulled some bullshit, and so he got stuck with an adaptation by credit. When the original draft, which took place in the Old West, those writers got the full screenplay credit instead, when really W.D. Richter should have been credited alongside them. So yeah, adaptation by credit generally means bullshit. So yeah, that's really the story of how it all went down. I don't know what else to do with it. Maybe someday down the line I'll talk about the full Werb and Colleary draft, and maybe if I can find the Masset and Zinman, or even the Cooper, or hell, maybe even the draft which had more of the explanations from the actual movie in it. Maybe I'll talk about that even. But that's all for Tomb Raider for now. This was an interesting experience. Considering how disappointing I found one of these scripts and how oddly interesting I found the flawed outline, and considering, I heard very little good about the Friedman draft, I actually ended up liking that one a lot. So that's the episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, guys. Bye.